Good morning.
Good morning.
That clock is wrong, so just so you know. I wanted to do two housekeeping things at the beginning of the class, but one of them I may postpone because it's to answer Greg Roy's question from last week about why the certain songs are in the past tense, and I'm hoping that they're just delayed, and so we'll hold off on that part. The first housekeeping thing is I wanted to point out to all of you, lest you think that the Episcopal Church doesn't pay any attention to the very topics that we've been talking about all fall. The Old Testament lesson next Sunday, okay, the last Sunday after Pentecost, is Ezekiel 34. And that is the lesson where God says that your shepherds have all run away, but I will provide you with the good shepherd. Okay? So we talked about that when we were talking about Ezekiel. On December 7th, which is the second Sunday of Advent, okay, the Old Testament lesson is Isaiah 40. Comfort, comfort ye my people, says the Lord. Speak ye tenderly to Jerusalem. We talked about it last week when we were talking about Deutero-Isaiah. In addition, the gospel that day is the beginning of the first chapter of Mark, where Mark has John the Baptist quoting from that very same passage from Isaiah. On December 14th, the gospel is from the first chapter of John, where John the Baptist says, "Here is someone you do not recognize, someone mightier than me, whose sandals I am unworthy to untie." And then the last piece that we've talked about, which will come up, will be on December 21st, when the Old Testament lesson will be 2 Samuel 7, and it is the entire Davidic covenant. In other words, the covenant that Nathan proclaimed to David, that your descendants will rule forever on the throne of David. So, lest you think this is all just wonderful Old Testament history, it's going to be coming right back at us as we approach Christmas and the birth of Jesus. I am going to hold off in the hope that Greg gets here. And so what I'm going to do now is pick up where we were last week. We finished by talking about the priestly writers who, during the exile, tried to address the question, where is God? And they tried to address it in various ways, pulling together stories, some of which were already known, some of which were their new interpretation on it. And I said their classic text is the first chapter of Genesis. And so I just want to pull some of it apart for us. But as I do this, I want you to try to imagine yourselves as Jews somewhere in Babylon who are asking, where is God? We don't have a temple. We don't have land. Where is God? So, the writers began, as we all know, first verse, in the beginning, classic language that we've all heard. Of course, that begs the question of what? Of creation, of the world as we know it. The Hebrew there actually says, when God began to create. Slightly different twist on that. The Hebrew word for create is bara. And in the Old Testament, God is always the subject of creating. He's the creator. He's the one. When the Old Testament talks about something being created, they're talking about God doing it. We're quickly told that there was darkness, Deep darkness covered the earth. Was that chaos? Was that evil threatening this creation? We're just told that there was deep darkness. And then in 3 to 5, the light comes out of the darkness. So the image of Jesus as the light of the world coming out of the darkness and into this world is not just John 1, but of course goes all the way back to the very beginning. The light comes into the world, we're told, and we immediately see something that God does that one might call a naming ceremony. God brings this creation into control by naming things. We tend to think about control by eliminating. Hence, Ben joking with Lynn Goodwin a few minutes ago about getting rid of boxes in our house as a way of gaining some control. I want to suggest to you right now that what we should do is name our boxes. Anyway, the point in all this is the chaos and the darkness are still there. But by naming, there is some control. Think about it with children. When they don't know what's out there, they're petrified. And if you can name what is there, the noise that they heard, the shadow that they saw, if you can name it,
They don't believe you.
they don't believe it. Well said, Greg. Well said. In verses 6 through 8, we're told that there was a watery chaos. And here, the writers of Genesis 1 introduce a 3-story universe that is going to be made orderly. And so we have the watery chaos that gets separated, and then the last phase of this 3-story universe made orderly will be the earth. In 9 to 13, we're told that the earth has a responsibility, and the responsibility is to produce. There's a pattern that's beginning to emerge in Genesis 1. We have light, we have firmament, we have earth, skeleton of this universe, okay? And then we have lights in the firmament, we have animals in the firmament and the water, and we have animals on the land. 14 to 19, the lights in the firmament are created. The great light is created, but not given a name. And one of the reasons why the great light to rule in the day is not given a name is because the writers knew that all around them were people who worshipped the deity of the sun. And so in writing this passage, without naming the great light, it doesn't become another god. 20 to 23, waters fill in, firmament filled with animals, and what we have in those verses is the first blessing. And that blessing is on the animals. 24 to 31, land creatures, and we have a change in the formula in 24 to 31. Let us make. What is the who or what is the us? The Trinity? Some have suggested that it could be a reference to Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, since in Genesis 1, God created, the Word was present, the Spirit hovered over the waters. Or is God simply referring to all that live in the divine realm with him. The angels, the archangels, all the heavenly hosts. Don't know, but he says, let us make. And it is here that human beings are made and given dominion over the earth. A dominion which is to take place within all of the goodness of creation. Human beings have a responsibility to preserve that goodness within God's creation. That dominion that you have here is not hierarchical, but it is much more of a harmonic dominion. And then God says, let us create human beings in God's image. We cannot determine his image from the text. What we are told is male and female, he created them. Then, the story that the priestly writers wrote concludes in chapter 2, in the first 4 verses. And it concludes with the final act of creation, which is rest. It is really the ultimate act of creation. Rest is dependent upon completing an act. Did you ever start a creative project and wonder why it never sort of came to an end? Well, sometimes it doesn't come to an end because you refuse to put it down and rest from it. To be able to step back, and as God did, to look at what he had done and to say, it is good. And that's the end. Now, if you really want to know how rest is the ultimate creative act, I urge you to pick up Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics. If my memory is correct, it's volume 4.
Rather hard to pick up, in fact.
Bingo. He's a German, and he wrote in German, so his sentences are this long, and when they get translated into English, they become that long. But he has a brilliant portion of the Dogmatics on why rest is the ultimate creative act, and why we can't understand creation or our own creating as God created without resting, stepping back, and saying, that's good. As long as you're creating, you're in the whirlwind of creating. It is only when you step out of it that you can look at it and say, that's good.
Well, and although this is probably simplistic, I think Bart would say that it's also what differentiates God from creation.
Yes.
The act of resting separates God from creation. It's not what he creates.
Right. If God did not rest, human beings would be nothing but puppets. Because if God didn't rest, just like the puppeteer, all that we do would still be controlled by the hand of God.
Would that be a bad thing?
Sometimes
Yeah, there's some days when I hear
I would
you.
not have done it.
Yeah.
Can I just say something
Yeah.
about the image also? I think that, and I get this from N.T. Wright, that kings who went in and conquered a land would set up statues of themselves to remind the inhabitants of who's in charge. And they were images of the ruler. And the writers, this priestly group, here they are in Babylon. You want to know that God is everywhere? because his image is everywhere. God set his image, and all of us people are here pointing away from ourselves to who is really in charge, just like images of a ruler.
As a side note, I'll tell you, on my way here, we stopped to get coffee, and this guy cut in front of like 3 cars. And this other guy pulled in next to him, and I'm sitting there and I'm talking to Morgan about it, and I'm going, oh, you know, the Christian in me is like, just let him go, whatever. And I said, then there's the other part of me who's like, why isn't he considerate of everyone else in the line? He's making us late to go see God. And my boys went, God is right here. And I was like, okay, you're right. I have to be reminded every day that God is right here with us, in my car, he's everywhere. And it's them who has to remind me of that.
Out of the mouths of our wonderful
Oh, yeah.
babes.
But just, the other piece about the stepping back and resting here is that this is the, it's the next creation story, the J count, where you have the Garden of Eden. And being banished from the Garden of Eden is the matching piece to God resting in the first, is God withdrawing and Adam, or humans being
allowed to do.
exactly having their own agency.
Right,
So-
and that's exactly the point that Bart makes.
Yeah.
We would not be free
Right,
if God didn't rest from creation.
right. And I'm saying within this creation story, that's the payoff, and God rested. And in the second account, and we were booted out of the Garden of Eden when we had our diapers changed and didn't have to worry about it.
Right, and here's the result. All right, now, I'm sorry, Mr. Hand.
It would almost seem like on that 7th day, when God rested, he defined rest different than we do today, because he was still doing something. He was evaluating, he was judging, he was doing an awful lot of things that today we wouldn't consider to be rest.
That's a good point.
It is a good point.
That's a very good point. We tend to think of rest today as, and of course, if rest is part of creation, then rest can't be let's go chill kind of event. But by stepping back, he was doing something. And by letting go, he was doing something. Because as Chuck pointed out, we see as the story unfolds that letting go had consequences. I mean, think about it. If he was the puppeteer and we were the puppets, we would not go anywhere or do anything that God would not have approved of. And go back one more time and think in the context. They're writing this in the context of the exile.
Yeah.
And he rested.
It also seems to me pretty
And
savvy.
how-
It also seems to me to be pretty savvy to have P and J follow up on each other the way they do, because if you had just ended with God resting, you might end up with a sort of what we today would call a deist version of religion, where God rested, now he's aloof
He's aloof.
and completely separate. But J then reminds us of, here's God in the midst of the garden.
Right.
He's still separate from his creation, but he's not aloof. He's very much intimate and involved in it.
Okay, before we move into post-exilic Judaism, we are now going back and pick up on Greg's question from last week. I did some investigating about the issue of the servant songs in the English translation being in the past tense. I was going to post something on the 909 Facebook group, but trying to put this into words was proving to be more difficult than I thought. So I figured it was just easier if I tried to say it than to try to put it into writing. Ancient Hebrew has no notion of tenses the way that we in the Western world understand them. However, medieval and modern Hebrew very much have tenses. So if you were in Israel today, be learning a past tense, a present tense, a future tense, perfect tense, yada, yada, yada. But the writers of ancient Hebrew didn't understand that, first point. Second point, acts were viewed as either being completed or incomplete. Now, this is where, stick with me, okay? A completed state, a completed act, is something that was finished or done. Okay, that sounds pretty reasonable, okay? And in that sense, it corresponds to the past tense. However, an ancient Hebrew form that we might translate, you remembered, okay, can also be read as our state of remembering is complete. So acts in ancient Hebrew also represent a state of being, all right? Now, the incomplete state indicates something not yet finished and generally refers to the future. So the incomplete state is an act or a state of being which is in the incomplete state, the act or the state of being is what is most important. When you are dealing with the completed state, it's the actor that's most important. In the incomplete, I'm saying this backwards. I'm sorry, I'm backwards. In the completed state, the act or the state of being is the main idea. In the incompleted state, what seems to be more prominent in the mind of the speaker is the person who is about to do something or the process that is about to happen. So therefore, the way the servant songs are translated, in particular, Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12, all right, is representing an incomplete state where the person is of major importance. But it also, from what I read, has a hint of that completed state because Isaiah is saying he's going to be bruised, he's going to be punished, you're not going to know him. And he puts all that in the past tense because he's talking about something that's going to happen in the future. The key in all of that is the servant. And the way the verbs are being translated into English is trying to convey this very complicated state of being that is in the future but completed. But it's incomplete because it hasn't really happened yet. Now, if you're thoroughly confused, good. Yeah.
I know they turned up large chunks of Isaiah in the Nag Hammadi text and other places, but again, we're talking about translating. We're dealing with medieval Hebrew here, or the first century's Septuagint.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have they. Did the Dead Sea Scrolls turn up any of the
Some
text?
portions of Isaiah turned up
Right.
in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think one or two of the servant songs were found there, but I think it's 42 and 45. I don't think it's...
Okay, I'm just looking for sources.
But even having said that, the Dead Sea Scrolls there was a shepherd. He was out with his sheep, 1947, out in some desert, and some windstorm had come through and had blown sand from left to right, and there's a cave, the opening to a cave, and this shepherd goes in, and there are all of these scrolls that were found. They turned out to be extant copies of some portions of the Hebrew Bible, some portions of the Old Testament, not all, but some portions. And what was there tended to confirm a lot of the research and a lot of the thought process on how the Old Testament came into being, and especially on the later books, the exilic and post-exilic books. Anyway, the bottom line is, the tense is interesting, but I think that the servant is the more important part that Isaiah is trying to convey to us. There will be a servant, and that servant isn't going to be recognized, and all of these things are going to happen. And when it when you realize this, it will feel like a past event because
Changes everything.
yeah, because it changes everything. Okay. Anyway, post-exile, 538. Persia, under Cyrus the king, defeats Babylonia. So you realize that in less than 200 years, we've gone from Assyrian control to Babylonian control, and now we're in Persian control. Cyrus orders all of the Jews to return to their homeland. Those that do find a land that is desolate. They find a remnant in the land whom they resent, and vice versa. And so they're going to try to rebuild. A man named Sheshbazzar was made the governor of Judah, i.e. put in charge. If you want to know more about Sheshbazzar, go read Ezra, in particular chapters 1 through 4. Ezra wrote there that King Cyrus himself brought out articles that King Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the Lord's temple in Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his own gods. Cyrus directed the treasurer of Persia to count these items and present them to Sheshbazzar, leader of the exiles returning to Judah. And then Cyrus goes on to give a long list of what was being returned. The interesting thing is Sheshbazzar seems to have led the Jews who wanted to return back to Jerusalem, and then he's gone. In chapter 2, Ezra moves right on to talking about Zerubbabel, who would be the next governor of Judah. However, interestingly enough, both Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel are both credited with rebuilding the temple. And if you read Matthew's genealogy, you'll find that Zerubbabel is in there. Now, Zerubbabel is identified as being a descendant of David, and I think it was Christine asked, did David have, how do we know that there weren't any other descendants of the last king of Judah? You remember his eyes, he saw his sons killed, his eyes were gouged out, and then off to exile. And the simple bottom line is, I can't answer that question, as I told Christine. However, Zerubbabel is identified as being a descendant of David. And here's another footnote, complete footnote. In the old Roman Rite, pre-Vatican II, the gospel to be read at the last Eucharist on Christmas Eve, meaning Christmas Eve morning or midday, not the midnight Eucharist. The last Eucharist of Advent, the gospel was always Matthew 1, which is the genealogy. So on the ultimate eve of the birth of Jesus. In the old days, what you heard was, and so begat so-and-so, and so begat so-and-so, and Zerubbabel begat, and many of these names that we've talked about, these kings, are in that genealogy. Anyway, back to the exile. Not everybody was in a big hurry to go back to Jerusalem. By now, exile had become an ongoing reality. Some of them had done rather well in the city of Babylon. Many had done well elsewhere in exile. This is the beginning, and I should have put this on your handout, of what will be known as the diaspora. Paul talks about this without actually using this word. Diaspora is the Greek word that means dispersion. And it refers to the Jews that were dispersed throughout what we call the Middle East today. They were dispersed, both from the northern kingdom and from the southern kingdom.
It's also the roots of diapos, through spores, where we get spores from. So it's the same.
Spores.
Yeah, it's that same notion.
Over time, some Jews would continue to trickle back. Sheshbazzar would lead the first group back, but others would begin to return because they wanted to reestablish the land. They wanted to reestablish their nation and their temple. But that would be a discouraging prospect from the very beginning. In 538, as they are trickling back, Israel is a nation only in terms of their allegiance and their covenant with God. Don't think of Israel in 538 BC as a nation, and don't think of it as being ethnically pure any longer. We'll come back to that point in a minute. The work that Zerubbabel wanted to begin on rebuilding the temple was halted almost immediately by the intrigues of the Samaritans. The Samaritans had remained in the northern kingdom, and they weren't really happy with these folks who were coming back. We stayed here, we tried to maintain the land, and you guys just went off and did whatever.
So the Samaritans are actually Jewish descendants?
They are descendants of the area of Samaria, which was in the northern kingdom. And some were Jewish and some were not because of intermarriage.
Okay.
The work on rebuilding the temple would be suspended for 18 years. And it would not resume until around 520, and it would be the work of Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets, who would get the work going in. Part of the reason that it ended up being suspended is that during these 18 years, there were revolts within the Persian Empire. Cyrus died. He was succeeded by a son named Darius, and there were not a lot of happy people in the Persian Empire with Darius. Haggai, the prophet, saw these revolts within the Persian Empire as a prelude to the coming of the Messianic age. However, the revolts were put down very quickly. Darius was firmly on the throne. And the enthusiasm that Haggai had managed to raise up among Jews that, hey, maybe the Messiah is really coming, waned. Zerubbabel, actually, I didn't say this earlier. He was a descendant of Jehoiakim, who was the next to last king of Judah. So he does have a Davidic connection. And he was seen by Haggai and Zechariah as a messianic figure. And they urged Jews to put their trust in Zerubbabel. And part of putting their trust in him meant, let's get going with rebuilding this temple. Now, Haggai and Zechariah were two prophets who urged the Jews, the returning Jews, to hold fast to their Davidic theology, to their Davidic understanding of who they were. We don't know a lot about Haggai. It is believed that he was in Babylonia and returned with that first wave of Jews returned from exile. He is the one who gave the first impetus for getting this temple rebuilt, because he believed firmly that the temple was necessary for Yahweh to come among the Jews. If you want Yahweh to come here, then we've got to rebuild a temple. Indeed, in his first chapter, he said, then Zerubbabel, son of Jehoiakim, and the remnant of God's people began to obey the message from the Lord their God. When they heard the words of the prophet Haggai, whom the Lord their God had sent, people feared the Lord. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave people this message from the Lord. I am with you, says the Lord. So the Lord sparked enthusiasm of Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, and enthusiasm for the high priest, and enthusiasm within the whole remnant of God's people. And they began to work on the house of their God. That happened in 520, because Haggai tells us it happened in the second year of King Darius's reign, and we can establish that from world history, so we know exactly when they finally began to do work on this temple. Zechariah, operating at roughly the same time, sees Jerusalem, indeed Mount Zion, as the holy place of God, of Yahweh, which must be restored. If you want God's active presence, we have got to get to work on this. He wrote, then another message came to me from the Lord. Zerubbabel is the one who laid the foundation of this temple, and he will complete it. Then you will know that the Lord of heaven's armies has sent me. Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see work begin, to see the plumb line in Zerubbabel's hand. Zechariah also believed that the coming of the Messianic age was near. We're back in the land. We're going to rebuild this temple. On top of that, he was very hostile to the Samaritans. He made it clear that the blessings of any approaching Messianic age are to only be enjoyed by Judah. Only Judah. No Samaritans, no Israelites from the northern kingdom, only Judah. Zechariah, in his writing, also introduced a concept that you don't see much of in earlier writings, and that is a transcendental character of God represented by angels. In the book of Zechariah, there are angels all over the place. The angels talk to each other, they talk to Zechariah, they talk to God, they talk to the high priest. They are all over the place. Zechariah also introduced a phrase that was not seen in earlier writings. In Zechariah 3, the first two verses, he refers to the Satan, the superhuman adversary. Then the angel showed me Jeshua, high priest, standing before an angel of the Lord. The accuser, the Satan, was there at the angel's right hand making accusations against Jeshua. And the Lord said to Satan, I, the Lord, reject your accusation, Satan. Yes, I, the Lord, who has chosen Jerusalem, rebuke you. Now, you'll also find a reference in 1 Chronicles, and I didn't write where it was, to Satan. But that would have been written around the same time as Zechariah. The book of Job, the dating of the book of Job is somewhat complicated. It might have been written earlier, and there are references in there to Satan. But Zechariah has this clear dialogue that involves Satan. The other thing that both Haggai and Zechariah were responsible for was taking steps in the direction of a narrow exclusiveness which would characterize post-exilic Judaism. In other words, who's in, who's out, the fighting, the bickering with the Samaritans, with Jews who stayed in the diaspora, didn't come back immediately, etc. The temple was dedicated in 515, dedicated by the high priest, who at this point was a de facto political and religious leader. Ezra reports that the elders were royally disappointed. The temple didn't compare to Solomon's. Ezra wrote, many of the older priests, Levites, and other leaders who had seen the first temple wept aloud when they saw the new temple's foundation. Others, however, were shouting for joy. The joyful shouting and weeping mingled together in a loud noise that could be heard a far distance away. Haggai also echoed the same concern. So they build the temple, and they still have questions. Where is Yahweh? Where is our King? We enter now a time, roughly 515 to about 450, where there's not a lot known about the Jews at this time. What we do know is they were still dispersed throughout the Middle East. There were even Jews in Egypt at this point of time who were considered to be out of line with authentic Judaism. Fortifications were being built within Jerusalem to protect the Jews from the Samaritans, from the Edomites, from anybody else who was around. Now bear in mind, the Edomites were the descendants of Esau. So what we're talking about here is protecting the Jews who have returned from people who would say they believed in the same God. Laws were established, but often not obeyed. Intermarriage was still rampant. And it is around this time that Nehemiah joins Ezra on the scene. And that's probably a perfect place for us to stop. Rather than launch into Nehemiah, we'll pick up with Nehemiah and move our way forward. Now, actually, I did think of something. We're into this time where not much is known. One of the things that reminds me is GB and I were chatting, I guess maybe it was 2 weeks ago. He came into my office and we were chatting about the class and all this kind of thing, and I gave you a wrong date for Plato and Socrates. We're moving into the period. I had them in the 500 BC and they're 400 into the early 300 BC. But what we were talking about is, while all of these things are playing out with the Jews, there's a whole world history that's playing out around them. And it's about to become a major factor in how these post-exilic Jews are going to see themselves and what they're going to hope for from their Messiah that they've been promised. So keep that in mind as we go forward. We're moving into time periods where you know a lot about this from high school world history, freshman year world history, etc.
So Judah was only 2 of the tribes, right? Or do I get that backwards?
Yes.
So they're trying to exclude most of Jews, or people from the original Israel people,
And their own poor people too.
Yeah.
and their own poor people.
Because remember, when they went into exile, Nebuchadnezzar left the poorest of them in Judah to run the farms and the olive groves and all like that. So there was a remnant
So there were
that
people,
never left.
there were people who weren't even allowed to leave, and they're being punished.
Right. But they probably intermarried. And if they did, that's where, from Haggai and Zechariah's point of view, that's where the stigma comes in. Okay? They intermarried, and that's a problem. So, we'll move forward into the 400s next week. There is no class 2 weeks from today, which is Thanksgiving weekend. There is no 909 for anybody, okay? So we've got 4 more Sundays to get us to 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Questions before we head out? Comments, answers?
Well, I think one thing that probably helpful to keep in mind is that when they were hoping that God, or were thinking that God would return when the temple was built, keep in mind that the images they had for God coming were the Exodus. So it would be something dramatic. They might not have known exactly what that would look like, but it would be decisive. It would
That's
be
a very
dramatic.
good point. Because
And
that's
so the temple's built and there's like
Not wrong.
nothing,
right.
nothing.
And that says a lot about the revolts in the Persian Empire when Darius became king, and why they would, see that as possibly the advent of the Messianic age. And of course it wasn't. Excellent. See you all next week.